OpTic Texas, who has had pretty much the worst land performances that I can remember from an OpTic team consistently, maybe since World War II. Obviously, the top 32 team or top 24 team at Champs is kind of at the forefront of my mind. But other than that, OpTic has been by and large very consistent on land. Certainly, usually a contender at these land events, and that has not been the case so far this season. And it kind of all changed at Major Four. Certainly, maybe not. We've talked about it before. OpTic fans, at least some of them, have the mentality if you're not first, you're last. So certainly, if they believe that, then they came in last again at Major Four. But this was a great performance. Certainly, especially considering Mercules has not had many of these events under his belt. He was at Major 3 with the Toronto Ultra, and he performed even better than anyone could ever imagine from him in that scenario. This time he comes in with a few weeks practice, a few weeks of Major 4 qualifying matches with OpTic, and they're able to get a top 4 finish. And honestly, like, you could argue that they were like, just because they finished fourth didn't mean that they were the fourth best team. They could have been argued as the third best team, considering the teams that they lost to. They had a very hard schedule ahead of them. I'd like to get your thoughts on OpTic and how they performed. And really, the one part I want to hone in on is OpTic a contender now that they've had a few weeks with Mercules. They're going to have double that in terms of practice over the next month or so before Champs. Where do you see OpTic in terms of contender status now that they've had a pretty good land performance under their belt?
I do think that, kind of just circling back with how you started this, talking about the top 4 in general, I don't think that's real. I mean, you can be nitpicky with a bunch of it, but like really, I mean, the top 2 isn't changing, even though Vancouver Surge has been in 2 grand finals. I still think the top 2 teams are FaZe and LAT because they're the teams with 2 championships, right? So after them, I guess you can do, if you're doing a top 4, you can argue Miami, Vancouver before Major 4, obviously, and now Toronto and OpTic. And OpTic, I mean, heading into Major 4, um, the big, I don't know if there's necessarily big, but like my focus and narrative wise for them was, um, they have the 3 top 8 finishes before this event. They needed to, they were in a decent spot for champs qualification wise for CDL points, but getting a first round win basically like clinched it for them, barring like a wild, you know, first or second place finish run from Minnesota and or C9. Um, so heading into their first round match here at Major 4, it was a rematch of that qualifier match we saw the week before, which feels like ancient history now. But,
Yeah.
um, mm, I forget the exact team. They Boston or OpTic lost to Boston and LAG, I believe, in the qualifiers. They beat Carolina and Toronto, I think, with Mercules. So it was, I just remember my like thought process and way I was describing it was like, if they were playing any other team heading into Major 4, I really wasn't sure who I was going to pick, whether OpTic or their opponent. But because I literally just saw them beat Toronto, I couldn't go against them. And to play devil's advocate there too, you could say like, it's a land matchup, and we don't necessarily know if something was going on with Toronto online. Obviously, we didn't hear anything, but that has been a thing throughout the year. Not to discredit OpTic anyway or anything, but there was like you could look at it from another perspective there with if you were wanting to pick Toronto in that matchup, and the fact that OpTic got a win over Toronto kind of in my eyes like showed that it wasn't necessarily a fluke in the online matchup. They did it
Yeah.
back-to-back matches, and most importantly, that was just a big win, because the worst possible thing for OpTic would have been losing that match to a team they just beat and then dropping down to the losers bracket with the uncertainty of their champs fate still in the balance, right? Like they drop down to the losers bracket, they lose whoever they play down there, and then they're sitting there watching the whole event, just like worried about, are we going to actually be a champs or not? So I think, you know, in the grand scheme of things, that was a really important match for OpTic. They got to play against Toronto, a team they'd already beaten, and they did it again. So that, in my eyes, circling back, this is like a long-winded circle for me, but circling back to our OpTic contenders right now, like if you viewed Toronto as contenders at any point this year, the fact OpTic now beat them twice, like that has to at least like put them in the conversation in my eyes. How highly you rank them though, just given the way we've seen LAT and Atlanta play, and even Miami. And now, full circle here, what I was trying to get to was OpTic in general at this event. They get a fourth place finish, but they only play 4 matches. They go 2-2, and they beat they beat Toronto and Minnesota, and they lose to FaZe and LAT. So that has to factor into the contender conversation too, with their 2 losses being against those, the quote unquote top 2 teams for most of this season. So, it would have been like a crazy, you know, it would have been a really cool talking point, and the green wall would have been going nuts if OpTic beat either LAT or Atlanta in their first event with Mercules. Like, that would have just been, the green wall would have been going nuts, and we would have had a totally different talking point here. But I think that's just a holistic way of looking at their run at the major. They took care of business in terms of the champs qualification. Got their best placing of the year with the new kid, which, side note here too, it's technically Mercury's worst placing in the CDL, which is kind of funny, but that's not a very serious comment, even though it's factually correct. But they have the momentum in my eyes, I think, going into champs, just in the sense of their losses were 2 teams that they probably weren't going to beat. I remember they beat LAT early in the year when Kenny had the 1v2 on Hacienda Surge Game 5, Round 11. But outside of that, I don't know how many wins they have against LAT or Atlanta this year. So just, I do think, fourth place is a obviously good spot to be in for OpTic. It got them that champ spot. It was their best placing so far this year. I think realistically speaking, just based on what's happened this year, it's very possible OpTic, might not get a top 4 finish at champs. But at the same time, just based on especially Vancouver at this last event, we don't know. They're kind of a wild card now heading into champs. And Miami's been playing very well as well. It's possible that just like mathematically speaking, the top 4 is most likely Atlanta, LA Thieves, barring some wild upsets that, it happened last year at champs, so it could happen again. But LAT, Atlanta, and then 2 of Miami, Vancouver, OpTic, and Toronto. Based on OpTic's performances against Toronto, I would put Toronto towards the end, but then at the same time, Vancouver with a top 12 finish, we'll talk about later. Where you want to put them, you could see, OpTic maybe fourth place is like what you can set the bar at for expectations going into champs.
So OpTic is 0-4 against FaZe this season, and they are 1-2 against LAT. They won that first match against the Thieves this season, which was back in January, I want to say. Yeah, January 19th, Game 5. And they played again in March, and then obviously this time around at Major 4. So, they haven't really had a ton of experience against this current Thieves roster. FaZe, we've talked about it before. Draza is kind of like anti-OpTic. He's basically the boogeyman. It's been bad, and OpTic fans have not reacted to it well, especially with this most recent loss. But I think for OpTic, it is encouraging at the very least to actually have some kind of momentum coming out of a LAN event. It feels like it has been the complete opposite for every other major so far this season. Of course, that major one was demoralizing and in many ways kind of ruined their season because they had 6-1 record in the qualifiers. They looked really, really strong. Then they go to the major, and I think they get top, and everything kind of spirals from there. They bring back Pred, and they just never kind of get their footing until most recently. And even then, coming into this event, we talked about it. They hadn't been able to string 2 wins together in a row. Unfortunately, they did that. You know, they beat Toronto online, and then they beat Toronto on land. So that's 2 wins in a row. And then they lost the phase, beat Minnesota, and lost. So they're back to the 1-1-1. But I think that's pretty understandable results, all things considered, when you're playing Atlanta and LAT, the two best teams by far in the league. And to answer my own question about whether OpTic are contenders, I've said this so many times this season, and usually I don't have to say it because usually OpTic is very good and they are always kind of considered contenders, even if they're not maybe performing up to standard at that moment. This season has been completely different. They were at risk of not even making champs
Yeah.
coming into last week. So like that's not a scenario where you can say, well, yeah, they're just kind of in a slump. Like, no, this was the entire season essentially where they were not competitive against any of these top teams, and even some of the worst teams. Granted, they're the only team, unless things changed at Major Four, and I don't remember, but I think they were the only team to lose to Vegas and LAG all season. I don't think there was another team to, even with Major Four. So that kind of proves how bad and how up and down OpTic, or mostly down OpTic, was this season. Um, but I've said it multiple times that I just can never count OpTic out because they have so much talent, and I've seen them in the past have just horrible performances online, and then they come to LAN and they're ready to go. And then sometimes it is the opposite. Sometimes on LAN they just kind of stink, and then they go back to online and they're back to the form that I expected them to. So I would say they're a contender because I can't count them out. I have more, I guess, more faith in OpTic to win champs than I do the Toronto Ultra, for example. Even though Toronto has been way more consistent, has been in general a better team, but I don't have the belief that they can like rise to that next level and beat specifically LAT and Atlanta. And we really haven't seen that all that much. Granted they're 1-6 against those teams. I'm saying about OpTic, but at the same point, I believe that Mercules is the kind of talent that could beat those teams. I think in general, OpTic has the talent to beat those teams. It's just kind of, will they be able to do it when it comes down to it? And they're going to have to right away have a very strong performance at champs, or they're going to have that long losers bracket run to even make it to that point.
Well, I was just gonna say too. I think really my initial answer there was like not actually factoring in the champs bracket,
Yeah,
which we
yeah,
obviously already know, and their first round matchup is against FaZe, so that's a really an incredibly tough first round matchup. Just and that's the byproduct of the season OpTics had, and they put themselves with their backs against the wall just due to their early season performances. But I think, if you aren't like thinking ahead like that, if you're just thinking like right now without looking at the actual matchups, like can OpTic win champs? Um, I think they got a shot, but obviously it's, like we've outlined it pretty well for the last, there's some teams you'd put above them. Um, that you'd probably feel a little more confident in to win champs. At the same time, though, just as a reminder, a year ago we were in this position. Our OpTic came in dead last at the final major before champs last season, and then they win champs. So you never really know with OpTic. I think it's kind of been proven at this point that last major of the regular season last year was more of a fluke, obviously just because they did you know win it all at champs. Um, but now it is a little different because they're technically coming into champs this year with their best placing of the year, as opposed to last year going into champs with their worst placing of the year. Um, At the same time, though, contender status or not, the important thing for OpTic, I think, over these next couple weeks is they're just going to get more reps in with Mercules, which young kid uh, hasn't been playing, you know, a ton of competitive or respawn over the years, and let alone only been playing a couple weeks with this actual roster. If they put some good work in, this team could get better, and that is a scary thought for a lot of these teams, especially just the way Mercules has played individually. And to their credit too, even a guy like Hook, who kind of is getting lost in all this, at one point earlier in the season was probably considered the best player on OpTic, and he played pretty well at this major for what I saw. Um, but end of the day, I think OpTic they showed the potential at this major, just that they can make something happen, but still with two losses against those quote unquote top two, it's going to be tough to uh, really say, yeah, OpTic is winning champs right now.
It's kind of remarkable, and I credit this almost exclusively to Mercules because I think very highly of Hook and Ashi and Shotzi. I think they're all great players in their own right. Yet when was with this team, I think you and I both were of the same mind that this team just does not have the championship material. They are not that close to, like we wouldn't even be considering what we're considering now of like, I mean, maybe, like they obviously have to beat FaZe. They have to probably beat LAT to get to the championship. At that point, they were losing to Vegas. They were, 1-4, 1-5 in these qualifiers. They look like one of the worst teams in the league. And I think the fact that they are where they are now, and I would say they're probably in the top half. I don't know, like if you look at betting odds or like how you would consider like most likely to win champs, but I would consider them to be in the top half of the 8-team field, which is not where they were at all a month ago or a month and a half ago. And I think that's a lot to do with Mercules and kind of what and how highly people think of him, and I think rightfully so, in how highly they think. But I did want to talk about that OpTic FaZe matchup because we saw it at Major 4, and while OpTic did lose again, I think I said it was their fourth consecutive loss this season. I don't know total what the record is because
Yeah,
for a while, or I think for maybe a year or so, OpTic was in control of the rivalry. They were very, very good. And over the last 2 years, maybe even three, I can't exactly remember, but we know what draws at least. It has been very heavily in favor of FaZe. And this match, again, went to FaZe 3-1. FaZe wins hard point, the search, and the second hard point. That being said, this was about as close of a series as it could get, especially in those first two maps. FaZe wins 250 to 246 on rewind hardpoint. 4 points is one of the closest hardpoint maps we've seen this season. I think we just saw 250 to 249 either this weekend or last week. And then it was a round 11 protocol search and destroy win. Again, like I think championship teams win these maps more often than not, and they're able to pull out wins even against teams that they maybe people would consider inferior. And I think a lot of people coming into this match thought OpTic is inferior to FaZe. And yet OpTic made a match out of it. And we just talked about like how little practice or relatively little practice they've had with Mercules, only 3 or 4 weeks heading into the FaZe has been together for the better part of 2 years now, like almost two full seasons. And yet OpTic almost pulled off this win. So I think that is a positive and encouraging sign for OpTic. I think they can beat FaZe. If we're just looking at talent, OpTic is very talented. FaZe is very talented. I would not give either team edge in terms of talent, or like if I did give an edge, I don't think it is significant. So I think OpTic has the chance, and that's what I'm opening the door to. Is it is not a guarantee in the first round at champs that OpTic is just going to lose and lay down against FaZe. even though the past has kind of dictated that that hasn't happened. Like I would imagine they're 1-9 or something over these last 2 seasons, and that's not great history, but we've seen at champs that some of that history usually does not actually matter. Comes down to.
And there was I'm trying to find it too because I thought it was two back to back. Maybe it was at Major 3 and then at or I'm looking at the Major 3 qualifiers right now, so maybe they played at Major 3. Oh, that's what I'm looking at. They 3'd Odom at the Major, and then yeah, so they played back to back basically. They played on April 20th and April 25th, OpTic in Atlanta, and OpTic beat them on Hacienda Hardpoint 250 to 143. Notably, this was during Atlanta's like remarkable hardpoint struggles that were very noteworthy. Um, and then there's another 6-5 search in the game 2, and then the game 4, Atlanta wins 250 to 244 on vault hardpoint. So that's another like very close series. It's a 3-1 win for Atlanta, but it's kind of deceiving just if you look at the um, actual maps. And then even at Major 3 itself, there's another 6-5 search and destroy map 2 and a 3-2 in the control. This time, though, Hacienda Hardpoint goes to phase 250 to 161. So even though FaZe is winning these matches 3-0, 3-1, there are a lot of close individual maps. And we talk about it. I forget the exact examples, but I always think about it in terms of like football when, like uh, division opponents play each other twice in the regular season and then they match up in the playoffs, and one team's 2-0 heading into that. I always say it's really hard to beat a team 3 times in the same season. And in terms of football stuff, this is at this point like it's got to be like FaZe has got to be confident going into the match, but at the same time, there are a lot of close individual maps, despite what the actual series scores may indicate if you don't take a little closer look.
I just looked it up, and OpTic over these last 2 seasons, all with Draza, OpTic is 1-11. Their one win is March 12th at Major 3. I think
Last
the
year,
loser, yeah, last year, losers finals, I believe. OpTic won that match, and so, um, so yeah, that is the only win over these last 2 years. But again, like it's really, it's relevant. These stats are relevant until they're not, right? Uh,
yep,
you know, if you think about the NFL, Josh Allen has lost to Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs however many times in the playoffs. That's all relevant until the Bills beat the Chiefs in the playoffs, and then people are like, "It's over." Mahomes can't beat Josh Allen, and so on and so forth. And I think that's what we'll be saying about OpTic if they're able to beat FaZe. And I'm still going to pick FaZe. I'm just, I'm going to say a month in advance, I'm going to pick FaZe in that first round matchup at Champs during the pick'em, and I know you
yep,
are too.
yep.
At the same point, I don't think that this is a bygone or a foregone conclusion, that OpTic is gonna just completely just collapse against FaZe.